Welcome everyone. This is an Oregon Family Impact Seminar, and we would like to tell you that it is sponsored by the Halliford Center for Healthy Children and Families, by the OSU Extension Service, and by the College of Public Health and Human Sciences. As a land-grant, we are part of a national network of universities that have offered Family Impact Seminars for years. And the purpose of a Family Impact Seminar is to identify timely topics and appropriate national experts to speak on topics that are relevant to policymakers in the state. So what we just finished doing was speaking last evening with Oregon State legislators, and this morning with Oregon State agency heads and managers. And it was a great experience. As you can imagine, our speakers have done much duty for us already in 24 hours, and they're about to do some more. But we're very happy to have them here today to talk not only to this group of OSU faculty and staff, but also this is being live streamed so that other Oregonians can watch it as well. So Rick.
So welcome to our road show. As Sally said, this is our third event, and we're pleased to land here with all of you. I know we'll have a great conversation afterward. There will be a reception following the session as well, so please feel free to join in. We'll have some food out there and just continue the conversation. I want to be sure to thank the other members of our committee who've been so instrumental in helping us plan all of this. It's been a long journey. We started last August.
Last February.
Last February, really. But the thick of it started in August. So Gloria Cron, Sally Bowman, Bobby Weber. Bobby, where are you? There you are in the back. Stephanie Burnell joined us for a spell as well. Wow, Burnell spells well. And we've had a couple of great student members. Rob Duncan, Rob, are you here? And Kelly Skoll. I don't know if Kelly's here yet. There you are. And Tasha Gallardi, who joined us at the end. So thanks to all of you who helped us create this series. It's my pleasure to introduce our two distinguished speakers. First, Greg Duncan, who is a distinguished professor of education at UC Irvine. And Greg is really one of our nation's most sought-after voices when it comes to questions of the long-term effects of hardship and poverty on children and families. And then joining with him, they've also worked together, which is also what makes this extra special. Cybele Raver, who's one of our nation's top experts in questions of early learning, and the two of them together are a terrific combination. They know a lot about interventions, and they know a lot about interventions, what works and what doesn't work when it comes to the questions of poverty. So with that, I welcome you.
Thank you very much.
Did you turn your mic?
I did turn it on. People can hear me? Good. I see a few heads in the back row nodding. It's delightful to be here, and it's great to see such a big crowd. This is the third presentation in as many hours, it seems. But it's been very interesting. We talked to legislators last night, agency heads. So it's great to see an academic audience, and we look forward to the question and answer period. I'm setting the stage for the star act, Cybele Raver. And wanted to start just with a little bit of background information about where we are in terms of school readiness for kids. If you take data from the Early Childhood Longitudinal Survey kindergarten cohort and classify kids according to their family income, they gave questionnaires to parents, and so you can rank kids according to whether they're in the top 20% of the income distribution or the bottom 20% of the income distribution. They gave achievement tests and math tests and teacher reports of various sorts of socio-emotional behaviors. And if you just compare the average reading or math achievement of high and low income kids, you see an advantage for high income kids. It's more than a standard deviation. It's a huge amount. Kids learn about a standard deviation of literacy or math across kindergarten. So kids are really starting out a full year behind. Especially troubling is the fact that this gap has grown substantially over the last 25 years, or over the last 40 years, grown by about 25 points. So, in contrast to the black-white achievement gap, which has fallen, it fell quite rapidly in the 70s and 80s as school desegregation brought more funding to schools serving black kids and brought more resources. In contrast to that declining gap by race, there's an increasing gap by income. If you play through and look at college graduation rates for high and low income kids, you also see an increasing gap. And it's really quite troubling development. This is Sean Reardon's work from the Wheeler Opportunity book that Dick Murnane and I edited. If you look at other kinds of characteristics of kids, in this case, school engagement, which is a teacher report of kids' ability to engage in school material, pay attention. This is, again, in kindergarten. You see a gap as well, about half a standard deviation, so it's not as much, but it still substantially favors high-income kids relative to low-income kids. You might hope that schools would be equalizing agents in our society, and these gaps, if you track these kids to 5th grade or 8th grade, would actually decline. But it turns out the reverse is true. The reading gap and math gap in 5th grade are actually higher than they are in kindergarten. Not much change, a little bit of a change for the worse in school engagement. All right, so kids spend time in school, they also spend time in families. They spend much more time in families, and one of the developments that I'm sure you're all aware of is how much income inequality has increased over the last 40 years. And one of the consequences is that the kind of expenditures that families make on behalf of their kids, you can take expenditure surveys and see how much parents are spending on lessons and summer camp and computers and private schooling sometimes, vacations. What you find is that this out-of-school family environment, enrichment expenditure for families in the top of the income distribution, amounts now to $10,000 per year per child. $10,000 per year per child. It's about $1,300 per year per child at the bottom end. And that's gone up tremendously by a factor of 3 since the early 70s. So, God bless them. We want families to spend money on behalf of their kids, but the kind of inequality is not only from the income levels, but also from education levels that schools have to compete against, right, to try to raise the achievement levels of kids is really quite formidable. So here's the pattern of income inequality. I think most of you are quite familiar with it. These are cut points for the top 20% of the income distribution, 80th percentile and 20th percentile. Things have gone south for low-income families and north by a substantial amount for high-income families. It's important to understand what's behind this increase in family income inequality, a number of demographic factors, but by far the most important thing is what's happening in the labor market. The fact that over the last 40 years, technological change has come to reward higher skills much more substantially than before. So the gap between college graduates and high school graduates is much higher now than it used to be. And globalization has removed jobs that used to be available for high school graduates with modest levels of skills. And it's really upped the ante on the kinds of skills that we need schools to be producing for especially low-income kids, so that when they graduate high school, they've got a set of skills that will really enable them, perhaps with some community college or possibly a 4-year college, after that, to get middle-class jobs. You can't solve this problem with increasing the minimum wage or increasing the generosity of the Earned Income Tax Credit. You need to promote intergenerational mobility through higher levels of skills, higher levels of education. It's one thing that leads us to be enthusiastic about the Common Core curriculum standards and the next generation science standards, which are very controversial, but they really represent an enormous opportunity for us to put in place and eventually help teachers teach a set of learning goals grade by grade that builds up the skills at a much higher level than used to be the case. So how do we address these gaps? There are mostly independent streams of child-based programs and parent-based programs. We'll be focusing on two-generation programs, Cybele especially, combining these two. But I wanted to talk just very briefly about, you can't just put together two mediocre programs, one directed at parents, one directed at kids, and expect the combination to be synergistic. You need to start out with strong parenting programs, strong child-based programs before thinking about combining them. So I want to just give an idea of some examples that I've run across either personally through the research that I've done or read about that kind of span different aspects of both child and parenting programs. One is a PreK model in Boston. Dick Murnane and I did the edited book with our opportunity, and we followed it up with a smaller, much smaller, 140-page book, not 650 pages, that summarized the 650-page book in 75 pages. It's always really disappointing to see that. But then in the second half, we tried to discover evidence-based models of education programs that had attained some level of scale, had been proven in rigorous assignments, in rigorous evaluations, and then tried to extract lessons from those successful models. And one of them was Boston. It's a very interesting kind of system. It's very curriculum focused. 4-year-olds learn from play, so it's very play-based, but it's structured in a way that kids are playing and supported by teachers to develop math skills, to develop literacy skills in a very systematic kind of progression that ends up leading them to have much higher math skills, literacy skills, executive function skills. That's another thing that was tested in the evaluation. One component is strong professional development plus coaching. It's somewhat more expensive. This book, Restoring Opportunity, has a website. You don't have to buy the book, but the website, restoringopportunity.com, has a 6-minute video that describes the Boston PreK system. And we also have links to all the transcripts of interviews that we took with the various actors, and it's a very interesting kind of model of a high-quality PreK system. And if you take the impacts, which were more than half standard deviation, and just apply them to the kind of reading gaps that I showed before, it makes a big takes a big cut out of the differences. We don't know yet whether they're going to persist. That evaluation is underway beyond the end of PreK, but it's a very kind of promising model. Another program that I've worked with that we also feature actually in the Restoring Opportunity book is the Milwaukee New Hope Work Support Program. So this is a program directed at parents, but the evaluation included an assessment of how the kids were doing. The teachers were asked about achievement levels and behavior levels, and you had these big differences that favored the New Hope kids in terms of school behavior and achievement. And this program was just a way to try to make work for low-income families. It was an offer. If families could show that they work 30 hours a week, they'd be entitled to a package of benefits, earning supplement that would bring their income below the poverty line, subsidized child care, subsidized health insurance. If people needed a temporary community service job to come up to the 30 hours, that was available. So it was just this package of benefits that families could take up or not, depending on their family situations and preferences. And it increased work, and as I say, it carried over into second-generation improvements. The third thing is a labor market job skill development kind of program. that is also in Wisconsin, and it's a partnership that is struck between industry and unions and workers that tries to identify through the employers skilled workers that are going to be needed and hired by a particular company as they expand. Right? And a big problem now is that companies don't have the workforce, the skilled workforce. So this is a way of trying to make that happen. So companies would step up and promise to hire into certain kinds of jobs, and then the coordinator of this program would work to piece together a training program that went from 1 to 4 weeks, 40 to 160 hours, that included basic life skills training. So some of these people coming in had very low levels of skills, but then very intensive training that would provide exactly the kind of skills that the employer would need. So sometimes you bring in community college instructors to provide these things. It would involve people from the existing workforce, from the company, to try to put together this package of skills that then would lead to people being hired. And it was evaluated by random assignment and shown to lead to substantial and fairly persistent gains in the earnings and work. So this is another aspect of potential two-generation program where you might be offering services to the kids, but also to the workforce development needs of the parents. So with that, let me turn it over to Cybele.
Hi, everyone. It's an honor to be here. A real pleasure to talk to everyone. I think both for me and Greg, the goal is to inspire you all to be the next generation of people that solve the problems that we're outlining. So we hope to get lots of feedback and comments and your new ideas. With that, I'm going to just take a step back to talk a little bit about why, from a neuropsychological and educational perspective and developmental perspective, it might make sense to invest in 2 generations rather than 1. From the neuroscience perspective, I would say that there's been a massive explosion in neuroscience research in the last 15 years. Neuroscience used to focus really intensively on perception and motor development, but increasingly focuses on the prefrontal cortex, the part of the evolutionarily newer part of the brain that really manages how to meet goals by really focusing your working memory, your attention, and your inhibitory control or your impulse control to be able to direct your behavior towards what you want to get done when lots else is going on in your environment. That's certainly true for adults. It's certainly true for me trying to get out of the door in the morning when I've got a kid and worry for work and subway schedule and tons else going on. It might be true for you as you're trying to finish your dissertation and thinking about how you're going to organize your thoughts as you get into your dissertation defense. But it's especially true for 4-year-olds, as Megan McClellan's work and many of you have already shown. When you think about what's going on developmentally in a preschool setting relative to a home setting, it's a lot to manage cognitively. And it happens to be a period where that portion of the brain is undergoing a great deal of change. What's important in that last 5 to 7 years of work is that we increasingly see clear evidence that poverty-related adversity disrupts that brain function and the development of that critical area of the brain in ways that are very deeply concerning through a whole set of neuroendocrine processes that I won't have time to cover in 2 minutes. But the short version is, if you map or graph executive function at 48 months, in this case in a large sample of rural and semi-rural families in Pennsylvania and North Carolina, the Family Life Project, as a function of the number of years that families are in poverty, net of their baseline characteristics at birth and net of kids' baseline characteristics, sort of controlling for a lot of family characteristics, their time invariant at birth, you still see a clear gradient where kids with 0 years of exposure to income poverty are doing a lot better at executive function than kids who've been exposed to 3 years of chronic poverty. And what's helpful is that I actually ran the same regression controlling for poverty, just looking at number of years in high financial strain, and found exactly the same linear relationship, helping to suggest the role of financial strain for kids. And of course, if it's affecting kids, the next question is, well, what is it doing in terms of adult function? And increasingly, we have really beautiful data from both social, psychological, and developmental research that poverty and poverty-related strain significantly disrupts cognitive processing among adults. It makes it really hard to make decisions. It makes it really hard to make appraisals of one's environment, so the tendency to make more negative appraisals. And it makes it often hard to be really highly motivated in conditions of high stress, which are exactly the factors that would really have a lot of meaning for both work and for parenting. In a current RCT that I'm running with Clancy Blair, we are looking at early Head Start families and a parenting intervention, and we're finding that clearly demonstrated at the behavioral level, and we are looking to see whether we find it at the biological level, but specifically families facing higher financial worry, more crowding, and higher levels of domestic violence the moms are clearly showing lower executive function and more sensitivity to negative stimuli and interpreting their baby's behavior in more negative ways. So that's a pretty grim story. But before I get to why we should intervene in two generations for this reason, I'll show you some empirical evidence from intervention research that tells me, at least, that the single generation approach only gets us half of the way there. So some of you may be familiar with some of the RCTs that I've been involved in preschool intervention. CSRP, the Chicago School Readiness Project, is one that I spent a lot of time on, where we clearly were able to close the gap that Greg mentioned earlier, with children showing less impulsivity and more attention on neuropsychological assessments with randomized assignment to a classroom-based intervention to support self-regulation. And then what we did was we followed kids through 5th grade, and we actually are now funded to see them at 9th grade. And what we found was that those neurocognitive gains were eroded dramatically. That in fact, all treatment gains were lost. And heartbreaking as a scholar, heartbreaking as a person who wants to make a difference in the world. But what we've realized in a subsequent set of papers is that it's clearly explicable from a set of large numbers of exposures to adversity in the household and in the neighborhood. And my graduate student, Dana McCoy, simply plotted where kids lived. They moved from 7 neighborhoods to over 30 neighborhoods in Chicago, and then plotted their exposure to homicides in those neighborhoods. And you can see that the overlap of kids' exposure to violent crime is quite substantial. And what we found was that was actually very clearly associated with their the problems that they were experiencing in terms of attention and impulse control. So the implication is clear that children need more robust, longer-term supports to navigate adversity. And who's with kids throughout the course of their development? Parents are with their kids throughout the course. I cannot inoculate a child in preschool in a really great program and hope that that inoculation sticks. As Ziegler taught me when he was my doctoral advisor, that model doesn't work. And I should have thought about that more as I undertook a preschool intervention. But then the second is obviously to really substantially invest in lowering exposure to adversity by supporting families' mobility out of poverty and into a living wage, where their stability is actually part of their environmental conditions that are earned through a reasonable source of income. So parenting interventions, from our perspective, Greg and I have talked a lot, that can really be conceived of in 2 ways. One, parenting intervention specifically where parents and kids are both the target of intervention. You could then really think about targeting parents' regulation, their appraisals when they're stressed, through a manualized approach that are often very focused on family assets. This idea that you're helping kids through helping parents to parent more effectively, but parent mental health and parent well-being is getting benefited along the way. And in those, I have to say, from looking at a lot of them, that when I see them target only 1 or 2 parent-child processes, it looks like they have a much higher chance of success. I haven't done a meta-analysis to plot effect size as a function of all the things they're trying to do, but just eyeballing it, that definitely looks like a recipe for success. And that's clearly tied to claims of supporting infant brain development, and it increasingly does. So if you look at Helen Neville's recent intervention, for example, there's good evidence to suggest supports for toddler attention that lead to better outcomes over the longer term. And then the second arm of intervention that we could really talk about is income self-sufficiency programs that help families to move out of poverty and to lower their exposure to adversity, which is exactly what Greg was just pointing out. And I'll just give a couple of examples from the parenting intervention landscape. Boosting it at the low intensity level, where you could actually imagine either a means tested or a universal platform of delivery so that every family gets some or gets the opportunity to have some. Susan Lamprey's PALS intervention has been really interesting to read and now to implement. We're currently doing it with the early Head Start sample. And Parent Core is something that's developed by Lori Miller-Brotman that's delivered through K through 3 and sometimes in early childhood classroom settings. But in many of these, it really is a combination of a use of video exemplars where first you show parents what it is that you want them to do. Then you give them a chance to practice, either with video feedback or in role play with some coaching, to support this level of behavioral change in parenting on a small number of dimensions. Often these are 12 to 14-week manualized curricula. These are not trying to change families over a year or 2 years. We finally learned that families cannot engage with that amount of dosage. That smaller is actually better if it's delivered with high intensity. And the cost is really important to the agency heads that we spoke with earlier today. You have to be able to keep that cost low. At a higher level, in terms of thinking about what we need to do about families who are quote-unquote deep in the system, who have extremely complex problems that involve sometimes substance abuse, mental health issues, exposure to violence, domestic violence, housing instability, lots of problems with finding and keeping jobs, we can really think about higher intensity services. And in a number of different cases, there's increasing interest in trauma-informed interventions for the families that are experiencing high levels of violence exposure or trauma exposure. Web-enhanced parent training, for example, for National Guard and Reserve troops is just being trialed right now by GORTS. It's a model that was developed initially by Fogach, really including very similar components of showing what it is that we want parents to do, helping parents to explain or express how they feel about it, checking to see whether they know, and then having a discussion forum all online in addition to parent support. And this is really trying to lower parents' arousal and distress in the face of others' non-compliance so that parents don't get so angry and so frustrated, or when others are potentially being rejecting. So for example, when a dad comes home from deployment and his kids are not responsive to him because the family has figured out a different system of engagement when he hasn't been at the dinner table for all those weeks. And his appraisals about how to enter that dining room conversation may be biased because he's just been exposed to a whole lot of traumatic events while seeing during his tour. So how to help him to lower that level of arousal or distress and to be able to engage pro-socially and proactively in that family system while also benefiting the kids in terms of more rules and routines and structures. A second type of model is really focusing on economic mobility and not focusing as much on parenting. So we've just recently found out a lot about the Crittenden Women's Union in Boston, which is really based primarily on a homelessness and transitional housing platform, where families who are in the program for about 2 years, where there's an intensive amount of casework done with each family, particularly around getting families into more stable housing, but getting moms into high enough paying jobs that they're earning $40,000 a year and not just $22,000 a year, with remarkable sort of track record and success in doing that. A lot of this involves goal setting and a lot of executive function kind of implicitly stitched into the way that the mentors work with the adult women in the intervention. And then financial incentives for meeting goals, so really conditional cash transfers with a match for savings, so that women leave the program not only with more stable housing, but with a savings account to buffer exogenous shocks that they might encounter later on. They've done a great job of monitoring employment, earning, housing stabilization, and family function and child outcomes. So even though they're not targeting parenting, they look at child outcomes as a key benchmark of their success. So just to summarize, the extent to which states and cities hear about these interventions and want to implement these interventions has to be really balanced by the tough budgetary decisions that policy leaders have to make. And what we have talked a lot about is the extent to which logic models really can serve as roadmaps to be able to help policy leaders understand all the different buckets of services that are being delivered in ways that they might be coordinated, and to capitalize on those investments across those silos, but in ways that aren't confusing to frontline workers and that are not confusing to families. So to have a marketed or clearly branded outcome or goal that everybody's really working towards. So Harlem Children's Zone, to get every kid to graduate from college is the marketed objective. Whether they actually meet that for every kid or not, everybody knows that's the goal. And then specifically just to emphasize that the point of maximizing return on investment would mean expanding existing services to provide this two-gen focus, really strengthening family psychological and economic assets, not simply kids' human capital. Not that that's not an important value, but that we have to think a little bit, or we're arguing to think a little bit beyond the specific child-focused human capital. And then also to think about where to capture or capitalize on services delivered to one and that might be accruing benefit to the other. So when delivering services to adults, what might we be finding if we assessed kids in those households? If we're delivering services to kids, what economic benefits are those actually providing to adults? We think of those as spillover. So with that, thank you. I tried really hard to keep it to just 20 minutes or 15 minutes each to give you the time. We really want to have this be a conversation and discussion. So with that.
Great, so we've got 20 full minutes. I think this is a record.
You guys after the third time, right?
Yeah, we took a whole hour in our last, and we thought, boy, we better cut it down.
This is terrific. So who'd like to start with a question? This is always a room of people eager to ask questions. Bridget.
Bridget will go.
All right.
So John and I, with Extension, are working with parenting educators and working with families to try to do a variety of different things. I, in particular, am looking at parent-child behaviors and mother's stress. And so the challenge that I think we're having, that I'm just curious, is really getting parents, or at least from my perspective, getting parents to even jump in and participate when you talk about things like parent-child interactions and child behavior, in your project. Because what at least I've observed so far is that they immediately go, "You're going to look at my parenting? Like,
you're judging."
Yeah, like yeah, exactly. And so I'm just curious, because obviously I focus on teachers a lot, but I think, we do need to be thinking about parents, but they've just been really challenging to recruit. So
I should also say that we're live streaming, and the people watching may not be able to hear the questions from the audience. So there's an extra burden on you to repeat the question a little bit.
Sure.
If you can.
So Bridget just asked a really great question about how to engage families in the context of the stigma or anxiety that it might provoke to talk about or look at their parenting, that they feel, I would just probably say, under some microscope, and now they may feel additionally judged. Right. So I would say that the interventions that we just mentioned do a fantastic job of keeping it simple. So like today and for the next 14 weeks, we're going to work on one thing, which is reading your baby's cues. Oh, and we're going to sneak in how to get your baby to not, embarrass you in the supermarket, right? So just extending it a little bit, but usually focusing on just one objective that seems kind of low threat. The other is to use technology to engage the family, both in the video piece, but Dana Suskin's work with the Lena machines, right? Yeah. So that it's almost like the Fitbit of parenting. Can you make 10,000 steps, right? I'm working hard on my 10,000 steps, right? There's 20,000 a day. So, I'm like incentivized by hearing about the success story of another person who's using the same technology. And the Lena, I think, we don't talk about that, but I think the motivational factor there is you are giving some really normative information and a tool that only the parent sees, and you're saying, knock yourself out. You can do this. The third is actually the online support. There's really interesting social psychological work on empathy and feeling motivated to address difficult things when the information's coming from an anonymous source online. And so There's somebody named Kevin Oxner, who's a grad student, actually uses mechanical Turk to generate empathic responses when people write what their concerns are. And people feel better receiving empathic responses, even though they're actually kind of faked. Right, so
Just don't tell them.
right. It's just to say we haven't thought a lot about how to use technology to lower the cost and the pain of engagement. But that I think is our job. Keep going.
I was curious about the physiological changes in the prefrontal cortex. You mentioned that in poverty, the development of the prefrontal cortex is inhibited. And I was wondering how much that's related to stress, or if there were other components.
So it's entirely driven by stress, or at least, sorry, the question is what's going on with the prefrontal cortex? Thank you.
This is an attention game. We're actually we're watching. We're judging.
No arousal experience here. The question of what the link is between poverty and disruptive prefrontal cortex function is fascinating in the sense that, is it transitory? Is it simply that with so many things to worry about and so much distraction and so many things that are chaotic about one's environment that are associated with poverty that we have suppressed cortical function? Or is it actually that something's going on neurobiologically that's actually disrupting the development of the prefrontal cortex? And both of those hypotheses are currently actively being tested in lots and lots of different ways. But on the physiological side, the argument is one of allostatic load, that kids experiencing higher stress experience disrupted cortisol release and a whole set of dopaminergic sort of chains that make it more difficult for prefrontal cortex development to unfold in a normative and reasonable way. Other people argue it's actually not that, but it's actually connectivity between a whole host of limbic area systems and prefrontal cortex development. That's really the story. We're, check back in 5 years or keep working, whichever side of the mix you're in. But it's definitely a fascinating and active part of the equation.
And then if you were to compare a brain of a child in poverty with the brain of a child who's doing quite well there, what differences would you see physiologically? Or is that under debates too?
So because we can't slice them open, we can only put them in fMRI, we don't really know. I mean, we don't have enough work right now to know both developmentally and in terms of individual differences, what are the sources of resilience for kids in poverty versus what are the sources of difficulty for other kids in poverty. It's a complex set of systems that are all operating in tandem, but also under high load and developing.
I mentioned we're trying to raise money for an RCT that gives money to low-income families and then tracks kids over the first 3 years of their lives. So the idea would be to recruit mothers all with incomes below the poverty line and assign half of them to get $4,000 payment the first 3 years of the kids' lives versus a nominal payment. So once you have that set up, the question is, what is it about the families that you want to be monitoring? What is it about the child's development that you want to be monitoring? And our plan is to have a home visit at 24 months where we'd be assessing stress levels of the mother, stress levels of the kid, parenting, quality interactions between parent and child, but also expenditures, expenditure differences. Did the moms use the income to move to a better neighborhood or a better unit? Did they use it to delay entry into the labor force following the birth of their child? For the 36-month time point, that's kind of the end. We want to keep going. And we don't have the money yet. We'd love to start. Then once we get to 36 months, we'd love to have additional money to keep going. But the idea would be, well, fMRIs are pretty much impossible for 36-month-olds, right? They don't nap regularly, and when they're conscious, they don't sit still. But it's also very, very expensive if you get 1,000 kids.
You have to be near a magnet. Might not be.
Right, right. But EEG, assessing the kind of connectivity across regions, and then many behavioral measures of cognitive development also. So Nathan Fox is one of our collaborators, and his bet, we have a lot of bets here, is that you ought to be able to observe EEG-based differences in cross-region connectivity between families that have been provided with this $333 monthly payment month after month after month for the first 40 months of their kids' lives. And that kind of backup, that kind of resource that families know is rock solid, for the first 3+ years of their kids' lives, will be sufficiently productive in the household to play through to observable changes in connectivity. So 5 years from now, we hope we will come back and talk about that.
Yeah.
So going a little bit into the policy approach, so we've had some precedents with No Child Left Behind and the Common Core adherence going on right now. Has there been any differences seen in the learning styles of high and low income kids based on these two different approaches on the policy level, or have you seen any differences out there, like has one approach been better for learning objectives in higher income kids or lower income kids?
So the question is about what has been the difference between No Child Left Behind and Common Core in terms of how it's played out for both high and low income kids. Well, Common Core is just being played out now, right? And it's really too early to tell what effect it's going to have. It's from the point of view, if you look over the history of educational standards and different policies, we've tried to simply give low-income schools more money. That's Title I. Right? We've tried to give parents choice with vouchers, charter schools, different kinds of administrative reforms. No Child Left Behind, to its credit, was the first serious attempt to hold schools accountable, not only for the general learning of their kids, but also for the learning of specific subgroups of kids, namely low-income kids in particular, right? And it was really the first kind of national commitment to ensuring that disadvantaged groups of kids were learning at the same rates or at acceptable rates as kids with a lot of advantages, right? The slide that I had that showed this increasing gap between low and high income kids over the last 40 years, if you actually track achievement levels of low income kids, they've gone up quite significantly, 40 points over the last 35 years or so. 4/10 of a standard deviation, that's quite a bit. The problem is that the achievement levels of high income kids have gone up by 0.75 standard deviation, right? And that's why the gap has increased. There have been a number of evaluations from No Child Left Behind. It's a little bit hard to evaluate because it just kind of came in all at once, but you can compare kids who are in private schools, which aren't subject to No Child Left Behind, right, to kids in public schools. And those studies tend to find some impact, some positive impacts for No Child Left Behind. You can argue that all of the anguish and evasion that accompanied No Child Left Behind made it ultimately counterproductive, and I think that's true. So this approach to not only setting learning goals that are quite ambitious for literacy, math, and social and science is really very promising. In addition, there are new assessments that are being developed. In math, for example, Common Core are learning goals both for procedural understanding as well as conceptual understanding. Right? And it's the conceptual understanding of math that we've never really tried to build in a systematic way. So teachers tend to learn the procedures, teach the procedures. The kids really don't understand what fractions are. A lot of kids in community college don't understand what fractions are. So it's, it's very promising in theory. It's gotten horribly tied up in politics. It was really developed by state school superintendents in conjunction with business community, with a lot of money from Gates and a couple other foundations. So it was developed independently of the national government. But then it became part in the race to the top, for example, and some of the big federal initiatives. States had to either adopt the Common Core or similarly progressive learning goals for their kids. And this was taken to be, all of a sudden it was Obama's Common Core, right? And therefore we have to be against it. Strategically, I think what happened to the detriment of the Common Core is that some states tried to just adopt the accountability standard that they had for teachers based on the old tests. All of a sudden they wanted to switch to accountability based on the new tests. Before there had been any professional development for the teachers, before the teachers had had a couple of years to kind of get to know the Common Core standards, use the new curricula and so forth. I think that was a huge mistake because it engendered a lot of objection. And then you had upper middle class parents whose kids, according to the new tests, were shown to be not learning so much, right? And by the old tests, they were fine. By the new tests, which are much more comprehensive, and oh no, my kid's self-esteem is going to be hurt. So it was a whole set. It still is a whole set of objections. It's still the case that the majority of states have bought into it, but it's very fragile in terms of its development. And I think it's incumbent upon everybody, and certainly schools of education, to try to promote the kind of wise implementation of the Common Core, because it really is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to increase the kind of literacy and math and science skills, communication skills, conceptual thinking skills that, if you look at economic changes, kids absolutely need to have any shot at middle-class jobs. So that was probably a longer answer than you were bargaining for, but it's certainly an ongoing challenge, and some states have just gone ahead and tried to make the most of it, and their teachers. In our book, Restoring Opportunity, we went to a really interesting set of charter schools in the south side of Chicago and New York City, small high school movement. That's another thing that we looked at. And all the teachers that we talked with embrace the Common Core. Finally, there's a clarity with respect to what should be taught in second grade, what the learning goals are in third grade, fourth grade. If I have a kid coming in from another school in third grade, I know what kind of math or literacy activities they were engaged in second grade. So they embrace it, and a lot of teachers do. And there are now developing these informal networks. Sometimes states try to formalize it to help bring good practices based on Common Core from teachers who develop those good practices to teachers who need to learn that. So we need to support that.
Yes.
So, and correct me if I'm wrong, but if these programs work and we're able to close the gap and give skills to children and parents, then I'm thinking in my mind we end up with this population that is more equal. What then? What happens then? Because in my mind, I'm thinking you still have things that make the difference between the child that comes from poverty and the child from a higher income, the difference between who gets those jobs, because there still are only so many jobs at that level. So what is the thought for if this was successful, then where does that put us? What do we need to think about then?
Yeah, so the question is, if this really works, right? If we put these programs in place and promote the skills of low-income kids, is the fact that high-income kids have all these advantages going to enable them to continue to be more successful. And I think it depends on the goals that you formulate for yourself. And I think at some basic level, the American goal is social mobility. Right? It's to be able to raise your kids so that they have a shot and they're likely to be doing better than you do. And that's especially true at the low and middle rungs of the income scale. Right? So even though there are continuing advantages to high-income families, just think about the advantages for navigating college selection, college admission, college financing. To have this one of the schools that we studied in New York City was serving a very low-income population, and they had a college counseling operation that was very intensive. And the director of it said, we're the parent with a master's degree sitting at the dinner table telling you, in our family, this is what we do. We do it very well. We work at it very hard. And that's the kind of philosophy that led to all the kids in this high school applying for college. 80% actually matriculated. So, to some extent, you can take practices of high-income families and apply them to low-income families and their kids, but there's always going to be a gap.
Well, except for the fact that that's not their parent, so you may still get the call when you're away at college that I need help paying the rent, can I have some of your financial aid, or you know what I mean, or there still is that gap when you're in that process. So it's those sorts of things that I wonder, how do you address every single little thing, and what are those little things? Because I think that's problematic once you hit that level of success.
Yes. I think, so just to extend the question and the answer, I think the idea that what is the target that we aspire to as developmental or social scientists with a strong internally driven mission to make a difference in the world. And I learned early on that I was not going to be able to show a gain in terms of learning or executive function for every kid in my sample. I was going to be able to show, if lucky, a gain for the group overall. And that meant that some kids on the spectrum were already high enough and they might gain a little bit. But what I really hoped was that the kids that were well below some threshold or on track, I could move some portion of them over the threshold. And some next person down the line was going to take their best shot at moving some other portion of that distribution over the threshold. And that collectively, we're all targeting various chunks of the threshold, of the distribution, to try to help to make that kind of a difference. The question is exactly right. We can't expect social services to solve every single problem, but we can figure out what makes the most sense to build the strongest pipeline that gives the widest amount of opportunity for wherever you are in the distribution.
And that seems like a great place to start. An inspirational message. Thank you again to both of you.